Hi everyone, my name is Natalie Gallimore. I'm a Decoding Dyslexia Ontario parent, and I'm also the volunteer research lead for Decoding Dyslexia Ontario. I live in Ottawa, and I have spent the better part of 2 years becoming familiar with the policy environment and the procedures that are occurring in Ontario that are limiting children's right to read. So I'd like to review the Ontario situation with you, especially in light of the current right to read inquiry that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has ongoing, with results expected in October of this year. So first slide is Ontario's situation. Ontario has no early screening for learning disabilities, let alone for dyslexia, but screeners do exist. Harvard reviewed a number of screeners and they actually vetted them, and this is available to the public. There's no teacher training in Ontario for dyslexia. Neither classroom teachers or special ed teachers are told about dyslexia, the indicators for dyslexia, or the type of reading instruction and reading intervention that students with dyslexia need. The science for dyslexia has evolved greatly in the past 20 years, but dyslexia has been known since the 1800s. But despite this increased knowledge, there's been no action by the Ontario government or the Ontario Teachers Colleges to change how we train our teachers. As well, we know that students are not identified with dyslexia until grades 3 or later. And in fact, rarely is the term dyslexia used. They're normally told they have a reading disorder, a phonological weakness, or something else, but rarely the term dyslexia. Finally, at age 15, we know that Ontario is not doing well with children that have reading disabilities. The failure rate for struggling readers has increased in Ontario over the past decade. So why do we have a problem teaching all children to read in our province? Well, let's look at the Ontario language curriculum. This curriculum covers grades 1 through 8, and it stipulates how teachers are supposed to be teaching in their classroom. The problem is the curriculum is not based on the science that we know from the past 20 years and even the science that preceded that. So the language curriculum does guarantee that all students will learn to read, but then they follow that by saying that they're going to use the cueing system. The cueing system has been proven to not work well for struggling readers, not just children with dyslexia. If you have any underlying issues that may affect reading acquisition, 3Q will not work well. And if children do learn to read using the 3Q method, they would still learn better using the scientific methods that have been proven to work with the most struggling readers, and that are students with severe dyslexia. So if you look at the curriculum, it says students will read, but it says they're going to gain their knowledge of words and they'll be using cueing systems. This is an oxymoron because, like I said, we know that 5 to 10% of all students will not read at all if the 3 cueing system is used exclusively without phonemic awareness, without phonological instruction, without systematic phonics. This is particularly for grade 1. It's from pages 40 and 41 of the language curriculum. If you read the language reading with fluency sections 3.2, predict meaning and solve familiar words using different type of cues, and they mention the 3 cues: semantic, syntactic, and graphophonic. Out of all of these, what we do know for children with dyslexia is that they should be decoding the words. They should be sounding them out. They should understand the letter to sound connections, and they should be able to logic their way through. There should be no guessing involved. So after the curriculum came out in 2016, what other possible barriers have arisen for children with dyslexia? Well, in 1982, the Ministry of Education had a policy and program memorandum number 8. It pertains to learning disabilities. And up until 2014, this policy included the term dyslexia. If you can look at item C below, you'll see that yes, dyslexia was actually in the learning disabilities policy by name. In 2014, this policy was rewritten. The term dyslexia was dropped. And this has made it more challenging for parents to understand that, one, their child could have a specific reading disability that is dyslexia, and 2, to get a diagnosis of dyslexia, since the term is not predominant in use in the province of Ontario, or actually Canada-wide. In 2015, the Ministry of Education struck a group to look into primary reading. They met for 6 months. It included representatives from school boards, from EQAO, and there was some problems with this report. So this is 2015, and the authors said that there's not a single method or combination of methods that can successfully teach all children to read. This is incorrect. Children's brains are predominantly the same. When they scan them with functional MRIs, we know that the reading networks are the same and that proficient readers show the same type of interconnectivity. And children that have successful remediation, those networks that are in proficient readers become stronger even in the reading impaired. Also from the primary reading discussion paper, they did indicate that they have an awareness of how important phonological awareness is. They said that they know that phonological awareness should be taught at a young age and that many students require explicit instruction. So they knew this in 2015. So why did they not implement it over the past 5 years? As well as you look at the triangle bar diagram, you will see that in the classroom, there are 3 critical elements for teaching children to read. There is the teacher, who we've already said doesn't get adequate training at their teacher college. There is the student, who is a sponge, who is young, their brain is developing, they're at the best neurological time to learn language. Finally, we have the curriculum. The curriculum is a challenge, as is teacher training. The curriculum is not evidence-based. It will not work as written for children with dyslexia if the teachers follow it. In 2016, the Ministry of Education came out with its new kindergarten program. So we've already established in 2015, they knew the importance of phonological processing, and that report also mentioned phonics. But in 2016, the kindergarten program is entirely inquiry-based, and it has no provisions for teaching phonemic awareness. It has no provisions to screen for dyslexia. It has no provisions to ask that incoming students, their parents are asked about reading challenges, because we do know that dyslexia is highly heritable. And if either the parents were not successful in learning to read or become competent spellers, these are all red flags to indicate that that child should be monitored for being at risk for dyslexia. In 2017, the Ministry of Education came out with its special education guidelines. These were replacing older guidelines that needed revision. So what this says is that if a child is working on the expectations of the grade level, so if I'm in grade 4 and I would be like to learning to read with my peers at grade 4, that you don't have to complete the child's IEP as robustly as if the child is working below grade level. This is a problem for children with dyslexia, because we know kids with dyslexia have normal to higher than normal intellect. This is a criteria for being diagnosed with dyslexia. So most parents aspire to have their child working at grade level with supports, and they'd like these written down in the IEP. But the flip side is this document says that if they are working at grade level, they're not to have all those special accommodations, extra reading intervention written down, because it's not necessary. As well, in the special Ontario guidelines that came out in 2017, the cues come up. So if you remember, I said the 3Q system as written in the 2006 curriculum don't work for children with dyslexia. But here it reappears in 2017 that a grade 4 student who has modified expectations, that rather than reading at grade 4 level like their peers, their expectations are modified. So they're reading at a grade 1 level. This means that they have failed to learn to read in junior kindergarten, senior kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4. They have been receiving the 3Q method because that's what the ministry tells teachers to use. So now in grade 4, the ministry is telling teachers to modify the expectations down to grade 1 and read unfamiliar words using the cues. This is a document targeted for teachers, let's be clear. So if the cues didn't work, in all those previous years, why would they begin working now? That child needs evidence-based reading intervention, and the intervention has to be based upon what the disability is. There's no other ifs, ands, or buts. There's no excuse for this to be written in this document. So in 2019, People for Education once again came out with their annual report. They run a survey of schools across the province, and for about a decade now, they've been asking about accessibility to diagnoses through assessments. And what we know is that schools in Ontario limit access to a psych ed assessment, and that is the only way that a child with dyslexia can receive a diagnosis of reading disability or specific learning disorder. So if you look at the chart on this table, it says that about 50% of secondary schools place limits on assessments, whereas 60% of elementary schools place limits on assessments. So when you limit the assessment, you're forcing children to go year over year not knowing what their problem is and not understanding why they can't read like other children. So if 3Q is not the answer, what is? Well, there's a lot of research on this, and in 2000, the Americans convened a panel of reading experts. They studied over 100,000 peer-reviewed studies, which is the gold standard in scientific research, because peer review means that they've had to have a certain number of students, that they followed scientific procedures, that everything was documented well. And this expert panel came out with 400-page plus report, and it's called the National Reading Panel Report. And Canada had a unique position because everybody on the National Reading Panel was American other than one. The University of Toronto was able to put one of their reading experts on the panel to watch all the research occur and to know the results of this panel report that took over 2 years to number crunch the data from 100,000 research studies. So they were very pleased to have a person represented on this panel because it was very high profile. And in the annual report of the University of Toronto in the year 2002, as stated on this slide, you will see that the professor that was the representative to the panel wrote that our findings clearly demonstrated that in the early school years, phonemic awareness training and systematic phonics instructions are key components of effective reading programs. These results stood up across a wide range of moderator variables. This is 2002. This is nearly 2 decades ago. This is the University of Toronto in the province of Ontario saying the key findings of this report. Yet, for the past 2 decades, I've shown you that we've released policy that are not in keeping with this scientific evidence. Why, and how can we change it? So we know that the scientific evidence does not match the Ontario education policy and procedure, and if it's not matching at the ministerial level, it's not matching at your individual board. So if teacher training is not teaching them about dyslexia, this is not specific to the Greater Toronto Area, it's not specific to Thunder Bay, it's not specific to Ottawa, it is province-wide. Same goes for the 3Q method. If that's what they're taught to use at their training programs across the province, that's what's being used in every school board and every school in the province predominantly, unless the teacher has gone out and done their own education into the science of reading and actually into effective reading instruction methodologies. So how does this affect our outcomes in Ontario? Well, we know that dyslexia has secondary mental health challenges. It usually starts with anxiety about going to school. Anyone with dyslexia can tell you that they don't like to read out loud on the fly in front of people. They like to be very familiar with the material since it is humiliating to make errors in reading off a paper. They can tell you that they don't like to pick the readers in grade 1 out of the bunch that the teacher has, because if they are actually to pick what they can read easily, their levels below their peers. And it's, again, an exercise in humiliation. They don't like to be going into groups because a lot of times when they're in groups, everybody else in their little group is a better reader than them. And all of this compounds by the time a child is in grade 5 or 6. And if no reading intervention and they've not made progress, they can get very depressed. They can have school refusal, and they can actually get physical ailments such as headaches and stomach aches, things associated with anxiety. This is the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, and these are reading gaps in special education students. I've circled the olive green colors if you can read them. They're in with a red box around them. And it indicates that the special education students, which is where learning disability with like reading disabled kids fall, they have poorer reading achievement than other groups that are monitored from an equity perspective. Lower than the English language learners, lower than the First Nations, Métis, Indigenous, and lower than just kids with low SES. But the other thing we know is that frequently special education students are not just special education students. It is not uncommon that a child will be all 4 of these groups. If you are an English language learner of a First Nations background from a low SES situation, you will be special education and your achievements will be much lower than somebody whose only challenge is just a reading impairment, and that's sad. This is from the Toronto District School Board. This is the largest school board, not only in Ontario, but in Canada. And this is data by race. So in the Toronto District School Board, you can see the racial background on the left-hand side, where it's what you expect in a multi-ethnic large city. And not only in Canada, you'd find this probably in Europe or in the United States. But if you look on the right-hand side and levels 2 and 1 reading from the EQAO assessments, the majority of Black students in Toronto in the year, this is from data from 2006, 2007, the majority of students could not read to a proficient level. You can compare that to the white students at the bottom of that same bar graph, where only about 30% were non-proficient, whereas 70% were. So this is not special education students. This is all students in that board by race, but it does show that there is a systemic problem in learning to read. But how many of the Black students have dyslexia? We don't know, because there's not screening and there are not assessments, because we have the same problem with white and all the other races. If you don't screen, you don't know. So you need to collect the data so you can address the problem. So the EQAO is an office in Ontario charged to run annual assessments, because back in 1996, the province decided that they needed an accountability office. That's what the AO stands for in EQAO. And they have done a lot of analysis of their data. And what they do know is that if you cannot read proficiently in grades 3 and 6, that you will have much poorer outcomes when it comes to secondary school. This is the importance of getting children to be proficient readers while in elementary school, because they will fail their grade 9 applied math, where most kids with reading disabilities will end up. And they'll have a challenging time passing the Ontario literacy test, which is given in grade 10. And they will drop out of school much more so than their reading abled peers. This is the TDSB, Toronto District School Board data on how people proceed through the different streams at schools. If you're not identified with a special education need, you'll likely take academic subjects at school. That's the large green box under grades 9 and 10. And you'll go on to apply to university, and you will graduate. 81% of kids without special education needs graduate from the Toronto District School Board as of this date in 2015. On the bottom are the kids that go into special education. they don't take academic level subjects. They take applied, or what they call essentials. Applied are courses that would get you into a college, a practical course post-secondary. But whereas 80% of kids without SEN graduate, 60% of kids with SEN, special educational needs, do not graduate. The majority don't graduate. So that is a stark comparison of what happens when reading is not addressed in the elementary years by the time they hit grades 11 or grade 12. And it's not getting better. You say, oh, sure, you know, they're not graduating, but things are getting better, right? Well, no, they're not. This is PISA. It's an international assessment run by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And their data shows that Ontario has gotten worse, that the reading gap has increased over the past decade. The square of Ontario shows that the rate has nearly doubled of people that are reading at below the proficiencies levels. And this is being measured at age 15, but the fact that they can't read goes back to the primary grades and how we instruct and intervene with reading challenges in the province. This is Stats Canada data on disability. If you look at the two highlighted boxes in this slide, one, children with disability, including reading disability, report higher rates of bullying. As well, over half of the children with disabilities say that their career selection will be limited by their disability, which makes sense because if you can't graduate from high school or if you can't attend post-secondary school in the program that you would like to do, you're limited and you're forced to make your choices from a much smaller selection than your learning abled, non-disabled peers. So the Stats Canada data for adults indicates what this does to your employment and your future economic stability. So if you have below upper secondary, meaning you've dropped out in grades 9 or 10, for females, less than 50% will be employed. For men, that's 65%. If you graduate high school, for females in Canada, 60% will be able to be employed, and for men, it's at 70%. But when you get to post-secondary and you continue on with your education, your employment is more stable, as is your income for your entire career. So one, graduate, but much more so now than before, a post-secondary education will help make your employment through your future adult life stable and expected. So this is inequity. This slide is about tutoring and private supports. So there are a number of private schools in the province of Ontario that specialize in teaching students with reading challenges how to read, just like there are in the United States or in England or any first world country. But this means that the middle class and the wealthy have a choice when their local public school fails. They can pay for a private tutor or they can send their child to specialty private school. This is not an option for people that are living in poverty and struggling to get by. And this makes the public school system even more inequitable. So Decoding Dyslexia Ontario has 5 goals that we think can change this situation, so to speak, turn the boat around and get us back on course. We'd like to see the kindergarten program that was introduced in 2016 and the primary reading curriculum rewritten to align with the scientific research. We'd like all teachers to be educated in dyslexia, in the science of reading and how to teach reading. And this would be teachers that are going to be teaching either in Ontario's English or French schools, because these ways of instructing language, they apply to all languages. Number 3, the special education teachers, they need to know how to remediate and intervene with kids that have dyslexia. They need to be able to provide the intervention, not just so that the learning and reading gaps don't grow. they need to be able to catch up to their peers so that by the time they are in grade 8, that the kids with dyslexia actually have the choice to take academic level subjects at high school. They can't be scared that they failed up until that point and now university, post-secondary is already out of their reach when they're only at age 13 and 14 in grade 8. Number 4, we know how to screen for dyslexia. The screeners have been vetted by Harvard University. So let's get screening in place in the province in kindergarten. And the screening must include a family history because of the heritability of dyslexia. It is low-hanging fruit to ask if the parents or if a relative had significant reading struggles or could not spell for the life of them, because this is also an indicator of dyslexia. 5, assistive technology. While the reading gap exists, while the kids cannot read to the level of their peers, all materials must be in digital format so that the children that cannot read adequately have access to the knowledge that their peers are learning through reading. And but just because you provide it in digital format, it does not let schools or boards off the hook for teaching students to read. All children need to know how to read. Reading and words are around them every day of their lives. It's a common expectation of all parents and all kids in Canada. So the Ontario Human Rights Commission launched its Right to Read inquiry last fall in October of 2019, but I'm just going to run a little bit of history of why we got this far. I think you've got an idea that for years the policy hasn't changed, but here we go. So in 2012, there was a landmark decision from the Supreme Court of Canada. It was about a boy, Jeffrey Moore, that could not learn to read in his local public school, and his parents opted to put him into a specialty private school. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada because the parents would have wanted the local board to pay for the private school because they said that the public school board failed in its duty to provide Jeffrey the services that he needed to learn how to read. And the Supreme Court decision is actually quite brilliant. It's very eloquent. And it comes down that all children and all parents expect their child to be taught to read in public school. And they did fine for discrimination Jeffrey. Jeffrey was not taught how to read like his peers, and he deserved to be taught how to read like his peers. And if the only place that could happen was at the specialty private school, they sided with the parents, and Jeffrey's tuition from grades 4 to grade 12 was paid for by his local school board. So that was a precedent-setting case that the Supreme Court decided. It's very important to know that your child has a right to learn to read in school, that other solutions such as providing AT, although that is helpful, that is not the same as being able to read. And it's just an important decision that everyone should be aware of, that in Canada, children should be expected taught in public school. In April of 2018, the Ontario Human Rights Commissioner herself opened the door to hearing from our community of parents where their children were not being taught to read in public school. She had asked specifically that parents please contact the commission with their stories of not being taught to read in public school, and that they would follow up because she affirmed that children had a right to equal access and equity in education, which included reading. In June of the same year, they indicated that they were going to update a policy to do with accessible education for students with disabilities. So this is all disabilities, but it definitely includes our children, and obviously Decoding Dyslexia Ontario was pleased to see this development. And the policy came out in 2018. It actually uses the term dyslexia therein. And when talking about dyslexia, it also mentions the Moore case from 2012. So for the 2018, when the new policy came out, they had webinars. The Ontario Human Rights Commission promoted it amongst the schools and school boards. They offered education sessions. And then in October 2019, they wanted to get a better understanding students' experiences in all Ontario public school boards. So they launched the Right to Read inquiry. And since the inquiry has been going on, there's a little clip here from Twitter, but the Ontario branch of the International Dyslexia Association has done radio interviews. Parents from Decoding Dyslexia Ontario have done radio interviews. There's been television coverage of some of the hearings that have gone on. So what in the Right to Read are they exactly looking for? So they're looking for universal design for learning. Are classrooms in Ontario, the general classroom, set up that all children can learn? And as you've seen from the evidence that I've shown, not really, because the way that we teach reading is not accessible for the struggling readers, and particularly the moderately severe dyslexic children that will appear in that classroom. Mandatory early screening. Well, there is no dyslexia screening, but they're investigating that if that could be part of the solution. They're looking at reading intervention programs. Are they evidence-based? Do they work for all children? And what grades are they offered? To offer a reading intervention in grade 8 is not the same as being able to offer a reading intervention in grade 1. The Science of Reading Education researchers have indicated that optimally you'd like to start reading intervention in grade 1 so that the skills and knowledge gap does not grow through grades 2 and grade 3 to through grade 4 until you potentially offer an evidence-based reading intervention. Effective accommodation. This can be having a support person in the class at times. This can be the digital and AT resources that children need. It could possibly be summer programs whereby students catch up and close the gap in the summer months if some school boards offer that. But the accommodations are something that are written down on a student's individual education plan and that the schools deliver. The psychoeducational assessments if required. Well, some children that continue to struggle after good classroom instruction, after good evidence-based reading interventions, some will struggle, and at that point you do need the educational assessment to know what the next steps are. How severe is the disability? Does this child need one-to-one structured literacy intervention? Even if your school board can't provide it, people that have the financial means can pay for that. But so you know, finance does limit accessibility because these assessments cost anywhere from $2,000 to $3,500. So again, that's inequity because people that have the means can secure that assessment from a private source, whereas people with lesser means must wait for the school to provide it or the school board to provide it, and they could be on a wait list for 1 to 2 years where their child is just following further and further behind and not understanding where exactly their challenges lie in learning to read. So what's going on with the Right to Read hearing over this year is they have had an online parent survey, which is now completed. There were in-person hearings that were streamed live through the internet. They were held in Brampton, London, Thunder Bay, and Ottawa, Ontario. And in the month of May, they had an educator and professionals survey, and they wanted to hear from all of these different communities so they could decide on what course of action that Ontario may be able to take and consider to close the reading gap and increase the equity in education in the province. So this was just a summary of the educator survey. So it wasn't just teachers they were looking to survey. They were looking for SLP, stands for speech language pathologists. They were looking at doctors and pediatricians. They were asking psychologists as well as social workers to complete the survey. So they have a good idea of all the supports that would surround a reading disabled child. Finally, I'll just throw this in. A movie premiered online on May 21st. It's a documentary, and it's about a similar struggle to what we are facing in Ontario, looking for evidence-based change in the state of Ohio. It's an excellent movie. You can see what these parents went through. It's 44 minutes long, and it's a good use of your time if you're interested to understand how policy and procedures in school boards and in districts affect the education that our children receive. So, as a final note, just going back to accessibility and equity, it's evidence-based reading instruction and reading remediation that does make school accessible for children with dyslexia. It's key. Just like the ramp provides accessibility to somebody with mobility impairments, evidence-based reading instruction and remediation make school accessible, and not just reading, all subjects, because everything relies on reading. It is a basic foundational skill for being successful in school. Thank you very much.